Qadri, but unfortunately Habib Qadri wasn't able to make it because his father had an accident, so please make dua for him. Inshallah, he gets better. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about homosexuality in Islam. Kind of taboo, but very relevant. So I'm going to introduce our speaker. Edmund Arroyo is a licensed clinical social worker and licensed school social worker. He's a graduate at the University of Illinois at Chicago Jane Addams School of Social Work and Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. He is the founder of the Heart Speak Institute, where the goal is to provide counseling and education to individuals, couples, and families in an environment that respects their individual and culture dynamics. With experiences in hospitals, public schools, and a child welfare agency, Edmund has worked with clients on many types of individual, family, and societal issues. He lives in the western suburbs of Chicago with his wife and 2 children, so give him your full attention and welcome.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Again, if you can, I'm going to pause for a minute to make, maybe we can say sort of Fatiha for Habib Qadri's father, who's in intensive care. It was sudden, so if you can all do that with me, I'd appreciate that. Okay, so Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's interesting because I told MAS, they asked me to do 2 sessions. I said, well, just give me the topics, and then they give me this topic, which is a difficult one to address in our community, just because I think a lot of people avoid it. And Habib was going to talk a little bit more about the Islamic perspective of it. I could shed a little light on that. And I was going to talk a little bit more about the social implications and those kind of things. So forgive me if you're not feeling like you get exactly what you want from this, but I hope to provide a little bit of insight, at least, inshallah. And they tried finding a substitute last minute, but it didn't surprise me they couldn't find somebody. Excuse me, brother, or sister, we need you to fill in. What's the topic? Homosexuality, no thanks, right? So, especially if you can't prepare for it properly, I understand that. Okay, so what I wanted to do is kind of, it's a little shaky up here. What I wanted to do is talk a little bit about this topic in light of, do we have bigger fish to fry, so to speak? Meaning that, okay, I understand this is important to talk about, but the way I see homosexuality is it's part of a bigger issue in our community, and that is one of hypersexuality. And I'm not saying our community, Muslim community, I'm saying the larger Western community, specifically the United States. The other thing I want to talk about is the myth of society, and that is that the West, and especially in the US, there's this message being sent to males and females, especially females, that I really reject, and especially because one of the big parts of my job is doing marriage counseling. And one of the messages that's sent is that your value is dependent upon how sexy you are. So, for example, when I was in high school, being pretty for girls was enough, meaning that was the emphasis. You had to be pretty. You had to wear, nice clothes and do your hair and wear makeup and all these other things. But that's not enough anymore. By media standards, the emphasis is on being sexy, and how sexy you are will determine your value. And we're buying into it. We're falling for it, hook, line, and sinker. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And especially for the same goes for men as well, is that we're falling for that as well when we're looking for a spouse sometimes, or significant other. And sometimes the thing that we're looking for, because that's what we think is attractive now, is not anything we want for a spouse. And that becomes a big challenge. And like I said, I see that in the marriage counseling that I do. I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of sexuality in the West and how we've come to have this discourse, and how some have taken certain vocabulary and like homophobia and blasted it at you the minute you want to talk about it from our perspective, and I think that's unfair. and I have some ideas of how to still continue that discourse. And then, like I said, that goes along with regaining the control of the discourse. How do we control that conversation or counter that conversation when people want to, call us homophobic? Okay, so first off, and I kind of threw this in this morning because I knew that Habib wasn't going to make it. But basically that is that Islam, in almost everything that we do, condemns an act, not a thought, right? And we know that we even get reward if you think of doing something and then you withdraw from doing it, okay? So this concept, all the scholars would agree on this. You know, and you could go online, and there's people much greater and much more knowledgeable than I am, and they, Hamza Yusuf, Dr. Jackson, and you can find, they talk about this, and they talk about how, nobody is held accountable for the thought. And I gave the different examples here. In a moment of anger, if you get really angry and you want to kill somebody because you're so angry, you're not held accountable for that. So we're not talking about, when we talk about, homosexuality or the thoughts, we do distinguish. And what you're going to find as I talk today is that the West, science, psychology, has also distinguished this in the past, the difference between thoughts and feelings and actions. In a moment of sadness, we're not held accountable for thoughts of suicide and things like that. It's really attempting it or doing something like that we'd be held accountable. And then in a moment of lust, I think when it comes to the homosexuality discourse, I don't see it much different than as a married man having to control your impulses as well. I don't buy the idea that it's how I feel, so I got to act on it. I don't buy that because I think a lot of people would say that. There's a lot of married men and married women that may feel attracted to somebody else, but it doesn't mean you have to act on it. See, because that's when you cross the line. So I don't buy that argument that a lot of people say. And here's the other thing. I'm all for sticking to the Quran and Sunnah, but we cannot negate all of the scholarly work that's done by scholars before us. Some great, great human beings that are it still amazes me when I look at some of the writings of some of our scholars, like Imam Nawawi, who wrote tons and tons and tons of books. And I just can't get through one sometimes. It's like trying to put one out. Like, how did they produce so much? They had barakah on their time. I think Imam Nawawi died when he was 40 or something like that. So how did they produce so much literature? They were blessed with barakah in their time. So they did so much, and they talk about these issues. They talk about the issues of sexuality and sexual feelings. This isn't anything new. So for us to just put a stamp on it and say, it's haram, that's it, no discussion, I think that really doesn't respect the work that they did and the great discussions that they had about this and how to bring that discussion into the discussions we're having nowadays. Okay, so here's an example, right? And this isn't even homosexuality, but just to show you that they recognize this. Imam al-Ghazali talks extensively about homosexuality or homosexual feelings and thoughts. But here's something that he even talks about: pedophilia, about a grown person's desire to be with a young person, right? And I'm not going to read that for you guys, but basically he's talking about how it's forbidden to look at them, right? And recognizes that these are feelings that people have, but it's not okay. It's not okay to do something about it, right? And I'll come back to that in a minute, but let's talk about this, okay? So in 1948, there's this thing that came out called the Kinsey scale, right? And still today, a lot of the gay rights activists will use this as saying, like, when it comes to humanity, often people aren't specifically heterosexual or specifically homosexual, but that most people, so if you look at like under number one, it's say 90% of that person's feelings would be heterosexual and 10% would be homosexual, right? But what this also implies is that for those 5 middle numbers there, it is kind of a choice, right? It is kind of a choice, and that very few people fall into that purely heterosexual, purely homosexual realm. So, but this is also sexuality unchecked. If you allow it to go unchecked, you know, especially when it comes to issues like pornography, what they find with pornography is that when people start looking at it, simple images aren't enough, and they need to go into more and more filthy and more raunchy and more disgusting things, to the point where often it will go towards children, or it'll go towards same-sex pornography and those kind of things. So it shows how, as a human being, we have the nafs, we have all these desires, whether it's, you know, when Imam Ghazali talks about common desires, you know, whether it's hunger or this, you know, I mean, they all can go to excess if we don't control them. And as Muslims, we have that responsibility to always find the middle ground and try to control these things. And actually, a healthy sexual desire is praiseworthy, but if it's channeled the right way. And so when you look at this continuum, you see that it's very natural. And I work with teenagers and college students sometimes, where you go to college and all of a sudden people try to make you feel like you're weird because you don't want to experiment. And then you have this concept of bisexuality, which is just absurd to me, because it basically means that I'll take it where I can get it. You know, you know, and it's kind of in this spectrum. It means that I don't care where it comes from, right? So I remember, and we can't apologize for our perspective on this. Now, it's just like I remember when my daughter was 8 years old or so, and I told my secretary one time, I was talking at the high school, and I said something like, "Oh, but she's not going to date." And she started laughing, and she goes, "Yeah, my husband said that too. He said they're all going to be nuns." And I was like, "No, I'm serious. When she comes to high school, she's not going to date." And then she just kind of looked at me like something, like I had a disease or something, like something was wrong for me for saying that, right? Almost as if, and then my other coworker too was like, "Really, Edmund, you think you could do that? You think it's going to happen?" And I said, "Yeah." Why? I said, "You see non-Muslim families, girls and boys who come through high school, they have lots of friends, but they don't date, right? And it's not because they're not good looking. They benefit from having all these relationships, these friendships, but they're not dating anybody." And they didn't think it was possible, and almost looked at me like I was tyrannical or something because I wasn't going to let my daughter date, right? But alhamdulillah, my daughter's had a wonderful high school experience with lots of friends, and she doesn't date. And it's almost, I think, you know, kind of like proof to them, like, wow, I didn't think it was possible. So there are all these things that our society that we live in, and this is, you know, we live in this country, I believe it's the best country in the world. But we've also got to realize that there's some illnesses here. And one of them is this concept of sexuality, and that it defines who you are. And so therefore, if you're not doing it or not acting on it, somehow you're not a person or something. I don't know what it is. But I thought this was, and I remember actually what's really interesting when I was in graduate school and when I was learning about Islam at the time. I hadn't converted yet. And, you know, one of my professors, I really butted heads with on this issue, because I said something in a paper, and she was a lesbian, and so she was very offended by it, and it wasn't really that offensive. I mean, I said something like how I don't agree with, you know, sexuality or homosexuality or something like that, and she started like marking up my paper. Keep in mind, I had no grammatical errors in this paper, but she gave me a C based on this paper only because she disagreed with what I was saying. And so I went into her office, and I really kind of butted heads with her, and I said, you know, you brought your emotion to this paper and didn't grade it fairly. And she actually ultimately, after about a half hour, admitted that. But I remember this is the first time she showed me this spectrum. And then I said to her, I said, well, that even helps me even more, because that says that there's for 90% of the people who may have a homosexual feeling have a choice of which way to go, because there's still some attraction. So, and I recently had a client in my office that, the situation was where, he acted out on homosexual feelings, thoughts. It wasn't a Muslim, but this is also an example why we can't have it as, the more we have it as an option, the more we just allow ourselves to go that way. It's like pornography. If we allow ourselves this, I'll look at a little bit, it just takes off in that direction. And so, his mom was freaked out because she found out that through the internet, through his email or something, that he had some interactions with some older men. And when I asked him, I said, and this is really, really interesting, I said, so would you consider yourself a homosexual? What are you attracted to women? And I asked him, I made a scale like this. I said, when it comes to being attracted to men versus attracted to women, what would you say? And he said, probably more towards women. I said, then what made you go and be with a man? And he said, the situation presented itself, which I think is an amazing statement, because as a heterosexual man, the way I function in society is not to let situations present themselves with women, right? And we're taught that. We're taught that, right? You don't let yourself be alone with a woman. It's that simple, right? And I always like telling a story that I used to coach football at the high school, and I was in the car with a couple of the coaches, and one of them said, hey, let's go grab some lunch. We're going to scout another football team to kind of spy on them. That's what, if you don't know what that means. And so one of the coaches says, hey, let's go to, I don't know what it was, TGI Fridays or Chili's or something like that. And then I said, who's going to be there? And they said, oh, this teacher and that teacher. And there was a bunch of young female teachers. And I said, nah, let's go somewhere else. And they're like, why? I go, I just don't hang out with young, pretty women. And they were like, they started laughing. They're like, what? And I was like, especially if they're going to be drinking, I don't want to be around them. And then I was like, that's how stuff happens. And they're like, whatever. They're all like, like telling me to shut up and those kind of things. And we're driving, and about 10 minutes later, the guy who had been coaching the longest, he was probably about 45, 50, he just says out of the blue, yeah, I've seen people do some pretty stupid things over the years. I was like, there you have it, right? So it's about drawing those lines and not putting yourself in those situations, not going to those chat sites and web pages and all these other things, because when it comes to sexuality, I think as human beings, it's one of the things that we all struggle with, right? Even in marriage, people struggle with it. You'd be surprised how often I see that. So, okay, so a little bit about the evolution of hypersexuality in the country. So what you need to understand about this country is that it was established largely on Christian ideals, okay, which is one of the reasons why there's still some very strong aspects of the society. But when it comes to sexuality, the Christian perspective, and this is actually from the Bible, in sin my mother conceived me, right? The concept that people are born out of sin, right? And that sex is some sinful thing. Well, we don't have that in our faith. It's considered a very beautiful thing. Now, even the concept that, if you were to have a relationship with your wife and it's during Ramadan, you can get up and still start fasting. Start your fasting before you shower and do ghusl. So you just can't pray. So, it considers something that makes you dirty for prayer before your Lord. But as far as a sinful, evil thing, we don't have that. So because of that in society and people feeling like every time they did it was some evil thing, you had in the U.S. The concept of the sexual revolution in the 1970s. The Kinsey report came out. They started doing this research saying, wait a second, everybody, they started talking about homosexuality and other sexuality. I had another column called asexuality, where they're not attracted to men or women, which I think sometimes in those cases it was an example of pedophilia, which they didn't really talk about. And then in the sexual revolution, it was like that whole, make love, not war, like anything goes, right? We don't want anything to stop us. Let's burn our bras and all the other stuff that they were doing back then and not care. You know, it was really, you know, just no rules. Let's not have any rules, right? The opposite end of the spectrum. So what's interesting about this is that in 1975 then, right, at the same time, as you start loosening the rules about sexuality in general, the American Psychological Association declared, okay, homosexuality is no longer a mental disorder, okay? Now, I'm not implying that it is, because I don't think it's a mental disorder, right? But what's interesting is that pedophilia, which is the attraction of an adult person to children, is still considered a mental disorder, right? And so when I talk about the concept of how just because somebody feels something doesn't mean we have to give them permission to act on it, right? Whereas before 1975, homosexuality was kind of perceived that way, and that's changed. And now when it comes to pedophilia, it hasn't changed, but those people would argue the same thing. It's just how I feel. It's how I was born. It's how I was made. Ever since I remember, this is how I felt. So if we keep going in this direction of hypersexuality, at what point do people start allowing that then, if the parents give permission or something crazy like that? Now, I'm not talking about these things being on the same level, because obviously one is a minor child, but I'm talking about being further along on the spectrum. And so we need to really consider that. So another example of how this has evolved and sexuality has started to become people's identity is that when I was in college, there was a gay-lesbian association. And then a few years later, the gay-lesbian-straight association. Then a few later, the gay-lesbian bisexual association. Then the gay-lesbian-straight bisexual transgender association. And now what is it? The gay, lesbian, sexual, or straight, bisexual, transgender, and questioning association. So, you know, it's really interesting, right, to see how, like, okay, what sexual group are you a part of, right? And trying to overemphasize that as being a part of who you are. So my argument all along has been like, look, who you're attracted to doesn't matter to me. That's not 90% of who you are. Please don't make it. Please don't make it 90% of who you are. You know, and I have, you know, there's a couple coworkers that I work with that I love and respect these guys. These guys are great human beings. I know that they would define themselves as homosexual, but it's never come up. It's not an issue. He may mention something about his partner, and I say, oh, okay, yeah. You know, we talk, and we have love and respect for each other, and you know, I'm Mexican, so I use the word love a little more freely than some people. But, like, you know, it's you know, we exchange gifts and those kind of things, and we talk about vacations. I mean, I don't want that to be who you are, okay? Meaning that I don't talk with them about my life in that way. So, okay. So here's an example of it. So I'm in the high school, and there's a poster talking about gay rights, and this is the picture they had. I'm like, why do people have to be half naked? Right? Why can't it just be somebody standing like this in a parade or something? Like, why do you have to make this so sexualized? Okay? And that's going to pull students into your meeting. I don't understand why it's going to go there. Okay? It's like, you know, it would be equivalent of like saying like a dating site and putting half-naked people up there. I mean, why does it have to be like that? Why does your connection and relationship with people have to immediately become defined in a sexual way? And I have a problem with that. Here's another thing I have a problem with. Okay. So I'm talking to a Muslim family in my office, and they're having some problems with their daughters, and there's a struggle there. And she's like, so the other day we were in, you know, Victoria's Secret because she got this coupon for a water bottle. I'm like, wait, how old is your daughter? She's like, she's 11. And I'm like, why are you getting her? Why is she even in Victoria's Secret? Right? Like, And why is she getting emails from them? And what, and then you're taking her there and she gets to carry this water bottle around that sends a message at 11 years old. And, I wanted to capture a picture like this, so I Googled, pink clothing line or something like that in my Google. And then all you have to do is scroll down. There's adolescent girls wearing underwear, and it's like, and trying to look sexy. And this is an example of what I'm talking about. Like, this is total, it's a brilliant marketing campaign by Victoria's Secret. It's like, they are capturing adolescent girls and telling them that your value in a couple of years is going to depend on how sexy you are. So start now. Start now as soon as you can. And on top of that, what really disturbs me as someone who works with married couples all the time is the word love next to it, where it says pink love, as if this has anything to do with love. But again, people are falling for it, especially girls, are falling for this concept that, you know what? If I dress like this, guys are going to love me. And what they're finding is the exact opposite. And this goes very deep into like sociobiology and, it's like this one girl that I worked with one time, she said, my mother always told me that guys want to date a prostitute but marry a virgin, right? And that's really, a hard way of saying that, really what our nuffs crave sometimes and what the nuffs of guys crave sometimes is not necessarily really what they want. And when the intellect gets involved, at some point, they reject it. And so then it makes them lose respect and all these other things, and then people wonder why they're not connecting or why, he'll date you for a while and then drop it and then get engaged, right? So these kind of things we're seeing. But again, do we really need to define ourselves this way? And that's what we're doing. We're falling into it as a Muslim community. Just go to the Arab world and see how many, underwear stores there are. It's like you can't. I was in Egypt this summer, and I was like, geez, anyways, it's just, we're really falling into it. And I'm all, I understand that the need for women to feel beautiful and everything else, especially within marriage, but we don't need to start at 11, 12 years old, right? Okay, so when it comes to the guys, okay, there are some other messages that are being sent in our society that really, it's going to be a dead end for us all. There's a book called Season of Life. I'd recommend it to everyone in the room. It's written by a Christian guy, and it's about, the guys really get into it too because it's about football. It's a football season. But with this guy, he played in the NFL. And what he's talking about is like the things he tries to teach the kids on his football team. Because what he realized in playing the NFL, I think he played for the Colts or the Giants, I can't remember, is society will tell you that as a man, he calls these the myths of manhood, that you need to be strong or really athletic, wealthy, and get as many women as possible because that tells you that you're really a man. And that tells you that it's like the whole idea, like, man, you're a pimp, right? The whole concept that people say and they laugh about it, meaning that you get lots of girls, okay? And somehow that makes them feel inflated, like they're a real macho kind of guy. But what he's saying is, in NFL, depression is rampant. And we've had some ex-NFL players commit suicide recently. But what he says is, like, if this is really true, guys in the NFL are like the best athletes in the world, okay? They have wealth, and they get tons of attention from women. But for some reason, they're unhappy. He said it's like you climb that ladder up this huge building, and you get there, and you look around, and you realize you're on the wrong building, right? So what he talks about is that, if we keep buying into this, both of these concepts, the one I talk about with women and one with men, what you'll find is that you have some very, very unhappy men and women. Because if you define yourself by your sexuality and you get to marriage and you're having a challenging point in your marriage and you're not having sex, then who are you? Then what does that say about you as a woman or you as a man? Does that mean you just leave then? You know, because there's lots of things that can cause that, whether it's challenges in the marriage, somebody's ill, whatever else, you have a lot of ebbs and flows in that area. So, and then this concept I think we need to reject, when couples talk about, or when people talk about like, oh, you have to wait till you get married to engage in that. And they said, how do you know if you're sexually compatible? And I'm like, that is the biggest garbage I ever heard of, because I met plenty of non-Muslim couples that were sexually compatible before marriage and weren't once they got married. Because just like everything else in life, it's something that you've got to work on. That's a whole nother discussion for the marriage discussion later. No, but it's just not real. It's just not real. I don't buy it. It's like anything else within your marriage. You have to just talk about it and discuss it and make it compatible. So here's my other thing is that, like, just to kind of help other people when you're having this discussion, help them frame their discourse. And one of the things I'll say to them is like, what would you think if I had 4 wives? Because you hear about it all the time, right? When people see it on the news or they see it like, oh, those women are oppressed, or whatever else. They have their own concept about it, and often they would say it's wrong. It's wrong. Well, that's because their society tells them that, right? If you go to Saudi Arabia, very few people would say that. Some do, but very few people would. And I'm not saying that's right the way it functions in Saudi Arabia either, but the point is, don't think for a minute that you're not influenced by the society that you're in. And so for me to have this perspective on homosexuality, I have a right to that, right? Because I believe you're so much more than that, and I'm not going to mistreat you because of that. I have, this kind of goes to the next one, right? I'm a convert, right? And none of my family is Muslim, but they eat pork and they drink. And do I judge them for that, right? The things that they do in their life, does it affect my relationship with them? Not at all. I can honestly say it doesn't. Sometimes it limits some of the activities that I could do with them, like if they're going out a certain place. But that's fine, and they respect that difference in me as well. But like I said, I don't have to let you do that in mine. So what happens every year is like, my mom's like, I'm getting old, I'm getting tired of doing Thanksgiving. Maybe you guys can do them. And I say, I'll have Thanksgiving at my house every year, but nobody could drink. And then also my brothers look at each other like, maybe one of us will have it, So it's like one of those things where, they want to be able to drink a beer or whatever else, but I don't have to allow it in my house. You can't, just because it's socially acceptable and most of the country does it, doesn't mean that I have to go along for the ride. Again, we don't have to apologize for our stance on some of these things. And then the last one, don't think you aren't susceptible. When it comes to the message that hypersexuality sends, express yourself, experiment, and all these other things, it's easy to be influenced by that. And especially when you're in college, you're around a lot of people that think that way. And they're all of a sudden, for the first time, unsupervised by their parents. And I tell teenagers all the time that when we're talking about drug issues, I say, look, I don't drink, I don't do drugs. But I'm not fooling myself for a minute to think that if I went to the bar every weekend, I wouldn't eventually start drinking. Because what starts to happen is you start to get desensitized to the idea that, well, that's where the shaitan sneaks in, right? And he says, well, if you just have one, you're not really drunk, right? Maybe you just have one just for social reasons. And I remember I was in a conference one time. It was a Zaytuna conference, and somebody raised their hand. They said, but it's really challenging for us. I felt so sorry for her. She said, in the corporate world, if you don't drink, you can't climb the ladder. And I thought, really? Do you really think that? Because there are a lot of people that do climb the ladder and they don't drink. Because they said, well, all the deals are done at the bar. Some of them are. But the fact that you feel you need to buy into that culture in order to fit in some way is really a bad place to be. Okay, so, when it comes to human rights, that's one of the big issues. And I agreed, like, nobody should be mistreated, period, right? We should stand up for people's rights as human beings, okay? Because like I said, they're more than their sexual feelings. It's not, we see people as the children of Adam, as our brother and sister, whether they're Muslim or Christian, and nobody should mistreat it or be discriminated against because of something like that, right? And, one of the things that Sheikh Hamza would say is that we got to be careful as well because, this isn't a Muslim country, and so because it's not a Muslim country, we can't hold non-Muslims accountable for our rules, right? And so that's part of the discussion. Like, look, this is how I feel about it. I'm not going to project that on you, but within me and my family and the way we function, this is how we feel about it. So, again, we don't have to apologize for that. Okay, and I think that's all I have. So, again, I just really want everybody to think about that concept of hypersexuality and how many messages we're getting. And I will tell you without a doubt that you got to be really careful because if you go along that path, and so often, and I see this in my office, so often what happens is all that hypersexuality building up leads to a very dysfunctional sex life later on when you actually get married and you get in that situation for real. Right? Because of all these things that you've programmed in your brain of what guys think they like or are attractive and what girls think are attractive, and they often can become kind of a turnoff to each other, and then before you know it, you're married, it's not happening at all, and you don't know why. So I feel like the issue of homosexuality is just part of this larger discussion, and what's interesting is that when it comes to, like I said, pedophilia earlier, in the definition of it, they just call it the feelings. But then if you act on it, it's something else. So with that, they distinguish the difference. Okay? That there's a difference between the feeling and then acting on it. But when it comes to homosexuality, no longer they do that. They just, it's all one thing. And it's also the group that you identify with, and it's the culture and everything else. Well, it can be, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be, and we don't have to accept that. So thank you. Assalamu alaikum. I'm going to answer some questions.
Assalamu alaikum. So we got a lot of questions. I kind of just went through them and took out the ones that were repeated. So if your question's not up here, don't worry. It's going to be answered because it's in here. Some were a bit inappropriate, so we're just not going to answer them. But here we go.
Okay, with some of these things I've got to be careful on because I'm not a scholar by any means. This one asks about, again, children as young as 5 who question their sexual identity and given a choice to have a sex change in the U.S. I would think that falls under the realm of not acceptable. Now, there's some very rare cases where children are born with both genitalia, where they very much are transgender in some way, where it is kind of an option to have a surgery one way or the other to make it more permanent in that direction. So that's a little different. But again, my question back to that question would be, why is a 5-year-old? How does a 5-year-old exactly question their sexuality? I have a 6-year-old son. He has no idea about sexuality. Right? Now, if you as a parent are concerned because of playing with dolls, that's a whole different story. Why do you feel the need to make that determination and make that an issue at such a young age? Because you'll see some, and we all know them, some people in our community where there's a man that's a little bit more feminine or a woman that's a little bit more masculine, and they're married and they're happily married. So we can't say, I think that person's gay, so therefore, that's up to that person. So, okay, so there's a lot of, what parts of the Quran can I read to understand the issue? And that's really difficult. Habib was going to talk a little bit more about that today. But, there's a story of Lot or Lut in the Quran. And again, I didn't even bring this up, probably because I was expecting him to. But in the story of Lut, the people of Lut were punished primarily for two things. Again, it's not about desires or feelings. It's about the act. So they were punished for sodomy, and they were punished for hypersexuality. Because basically it was open and rampant in the society, sexuality in general. And so when the Prophet Lut peace be upon him, tried to speak out against it, they said they were going to chase him out if he doesn't stop. So again, just because the society says this is what we accept doesn't mean that we have to. And because, and then it goes on to say that, Allah sent two angels who were very beautiful. And the Prophet Lut tried to protect them, peace be upon him, try to protect them from the mobs, from the people who wanted to see these beautiful people because, again, they were hypersexual, right? And then that's ultimately why the people were punished, because they even against what the Prophet Lut said, they pursued those two angels. At the end, you could read the story, and it's kind of split up in different parts of the Quran, but we have amazing technology now where you can just put in Lut or something like that, and you can find more about that. But again, it doesn't really tell you the whole story. I would talk to a scholar about it. Alhamdulillah, I've been able to have these conversations with some scholars. And, okay, let's see. A question about it being genetic. I don't think, maybe I didn't make that clear enough. I think sexuality is genetic in that you can have a predisposition to certain things, right? And I think pretty much the consensus of the scholars is that, if you look at that spectrum and you look at people having different feelings, it all depends on how you channel that and where you go, what you allow yourself to do, what you think is acceptable. Again, and you can go very far in one direction or other, kind of like the example that young man that I met with, and he said the situation presented itself. So there's a lot of things that are genetic, right? But it's genetic. If you look at sociobiology, it's genetic for a man. It's genetic for a man to want to be with hundreds of women because it increases the likelihood of them having more and more offspring to carry forward. That's genetic. Does that mean that we do it? No. So genetic isn't a good argument. Okay, my brother's Muslim friend told my brother that he was gay. My brother wants to help him, but without getting affected. How do you think he should address this problem? Well, he should talk to an adult about it, first of all. That's one of the things that I'm glad someone brought this question up, because, one of the reasons why I agreed to do the speech is because we need to start talking about these things. Someone needs to be, it's kind of like, the extreme element in our society as well, where you have people in our community getting in trouble for acts of terrorism and things like that. A lot of times they're young people, and it's the same kind of thing. If we're not talking about this stuff, it doesn't give people the opportunity to ask the questions they need to. I was working with a Muslim woman a few years back, and she was in college, and she started struggling with this. She really started struggling with this. She was engaged with someone, and he was really, really mean to her, broke off the engagement, and she was really struggling, because then she met this lesbian in college, and she's like, I think I'm really attracted to her. And we talked about that, and just giving her the opportunity to discuss that, I think helped her through it. And now she reflects back on it. She's like, yeah, it was just a really emotional time for me, and that was an opportunity where I can latch onto someone. So we need to be able to discuss these things and have those conversations. Possibly that your brother can maybe let somebody know, an adult know, that can have that conversation with him. I have a friend who loves Islam and has potential to become a Muslim but is homosexual. How can you bring someone to Islam when it conflicts with his sexual identity? Okay, first of all, what does it take to be a Muslim? Right? Shahada. Okay? If someone drinks alcohol, they can still accept Islam. Okay? But they're expected at some point to stop that. But believing in Allah and His Prophet, peace be upon him, doesn't say anything about your sexuality. Sure, there's all these rules that we have set up in our faith, but because someone has one aspect, again, remember I said this isn't who they are, one aspect of who they are doesn't keep them from being able to accept the faith. Should the Muslim community use polygamy as a bargaining chip? Yeah, well, I kind of said that when discussing allowing or probably gay marriage in society, or prohibiting gay marriage in society. As a bargaining chip, I mean, meaning kind of like I said, yeah, I mean, they don't allow multiple marriages in our society. Why? Because some people think it's wrong, you know, or polygamous marriage. Some people think it's wrong. Well, if you're allowed to have that perspective, why can't I have my perspective? And then we just don't talk about it. You know, they say in American society, there's two things you don't talk about, politics and religion, because it tends to argue. And maybe this isn't our topic. There's no reason for us to be talking about our sexuality with our neighbor or those kind of things. Okay, aside from actions, the problem is growing between Muslims. France has a gay-friendly mosque. What do we do about that? It's now normal. I don't know, people, there's always going to be elements of our society that will, it's kind of like, I always say, you know, I always say that, you know, misery loves company. So if I'm doing something wrong, the more I can get people to do it wrong with me, the better I feel about myself. So, you know, if I can get an organization that supports it, that's even better. So, I mean, I don't know, you know, what do we do about it? That's a big question. I mean, like I said, it starts with the dialogue. How do you deal with such a sexual society? In other words, things depend about, I'm not sure what this means. Kind of like what I said. I mean, we don't have to buy into it. There's nothing wrong with maintaining yourself and looking beautiful, men and women. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, just don't buy into the idea that, you know, well, you know, they say in marketing, right, sex sells. So that's one of the reasons why it's become such a big part, is in all the billboards, everything else, you know, it sells. How do you suggest we protect our young boys? They're on young men and, of course, not women. What is too much information to discuss? Well, it's a good question. I think when they hit puberty, you need to have these discussions with them. I remember when I was in 5th grade, you know, this is some things we don't talk with our kids about. We don't talk with them about sex. We don't talk with them about drugs. And so why is it a surprise when it comes up when they start doing one or the other? Okay? I remember when I was in 5th grade. So how old is that? 11 probably, right? 5th grade? No, maybe 12. Yeah. Okay, so when I was 5th grade, remember, it was the talk. My parents called me upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table, and they talked to me about sex, right? And then my brother was laughing downstairs, my older brother, because he knew what they were talking to me about, right? And then afterwards, he was imitating my dad. He's like, did Dad say this and say this? So, but his job was to keep my other brothers downstairs while my dad was talking to me about it. So we need to be able to have these conversations with them because they're getting this information. I remember my daughter went to Robert Crown Center, which is in the western suburbs of Chicago. It's this thing that organization that's funded to help kids learn about puberty and all these other things because teachers don't know how to talk about it, right? So during, I think it's 6th grade, they go and they talk about body changes and all these other things. And then 7th grade, they go and they talk about sexuality. And I remember my daughter came home and she started asking me questions, and I was really disturbed by the message that she got from that presentation. And so that kind of opened up a conversation with her about that. And again, because I believe in this stuff, I practice what I preach. I talk to my kids about this thing. I've talked to my daughter about drugs ever since she even heard the word. And I said, watch, when you get into high school, a certain amount of kids are going to be using it, even kids that you respect, but you watch the path they take, right? And it never fails, Anyways, I don't want to get into the drug topic. It gets me too heated. Okay. It used to be that people were very careful to admit that they were homosexual, but now many people are coming out of the closet. So as a Muslim, what position can we take to start our religion's perspective while not offending people or looking like the bad guy when saying homosexuality is wrong? Well, again, I wouldn't say homosexuality is wrong. When you say a statement like that, it's like saying, again, Islam doesn't condemn people for thoughts or feelings, okay? And if you say it to someone, that's saying that you're a wrong person, and that's where it starts making them feel bad about themselves, and then they're going to really reject your message. I wouldn't even talk about it unless you're willing to sit down and really have a full conversation. If someone says to you, what does Islam say about homosexuality? You don't just say, it says it's wrong, right? Because there's so much behind that. So you want to sit down with them and actually have a dialogue about it, an intellectual dialogue about it. I've heard about the book called America Pornified. That speaks about how most perversions like pedophilia and homosexuality is a result of desensitization from being exposed. So that kind of goes along with what I said. Simple nudity to porn, hardcore, actually leading to such perversions. Well, yeah, like I said, can you comment? So, yes. Again, when you do research on pornography, so much, especially at a young age. When we say young age, when anything starts, here's really interesting what science is really revealing now with the brain imagery that we have, is that, subhanAllah, I mean, like, the way Allah has created our bodies is amazing. But what we found is that when you expose your brain to certain things, whether it's drugs or alcohol or pornography, some of these things that your mind is not ready for, meaning that it's not fully developed at a young age, and I say anytime, even before 18, it actually changes your brain. It actually changes your brain, and that actively working on that, like for example, there's a person I saw yesterday who's struggling with some addiction, or Friday, and so it's like he has an addiction, but it's like, okay, you've been doing this for the last 8 years. Your brain has changed, and this is why they call addiction now a disease, because once you start using something and you continue to use it, it actively starts to change how your brain functions. And so then 5 years later, it's no longer a matter of willpower. It's no longer a moral weakness, because your brain now needs that. It's almost like hunger, right? So your brain now needs that. It's like someone who's extremely overweight. You can't just stop and go on diet. It's so hard, right? It's your brain has been trained to function that way. So if they call it a disease, the disease model, you've got to treat addiction like a disease. So the same kind of thing here is that, like your brain being exposed to these things does change, and what you accept does change. And one of the things that Imam Ghazali talks about is, making sure, he talks about, as simple as not looking at women if you have a hypersexuality, right? Not looking at them, trying to lower your gaze, those kind of things. Well, what about if you're looking at pornography then? How do you think that's going to affect you spiritually and then psychologically? And then, the other aspect of it is when it comes to just I lost my train of thought there because I read this question. It says, is it okay to keep close personal relationship with homosexuals? Where do you draw the line? Again, I think you have to be careful. I don't want to put them in the same category as a drug addict or something like that. But, again, it's a small aspect of who they are. Close personal friend, what does that really mean? How close? You, as a best friend? I don't necessarily think I would advise that. But if it's somebody, like I said, like I have colleagues at work, we get along really well, and I respect them. And, but when it comes to, again, not surrounding yourself, not putting yourself in a situation that because you think you're strong enough. That's what a lot of married people do. That's your first mistake in marriage, is thinking that you're strong enough to resist. I can go out with my coworker. She's kind of cute, but I'm not really attracted to her. We'll just go to, it's just lunch. There's a lot of people around. It's okay. And that's just how it starts. So same thing with this, again, at a time where you've been receiving these messages for a long time, and let's talk about the reality. Reality is that there's a lot of hormones running through the bodies of young people, and so it doesn't take much and considering that we're sexual beings by our nature, and like I said, a healthy sexuality is actually praiseworthy, but we have a responsibility to keep this in check and monitor it. And one of the ways is surrounding ourselves with good people. Just surrounding ourselves with good people. And then also our connection with Allah is paramount, right? If we have to answer to Allah every day, if we're praying, if we feel this responsibility towards Him, we need the spiritual aspect of ourselves, and we need the law. There's a reason. The law is very clear. It's not acceptable. Sexual acts are not acceptable. But then our scholars who address the spiritual aspects of this go a little more into explaining it, talking about how to avoid it. They talk about fasting. They talk about a person who is in the middle somewhere, marrying as soon as they can to get some sexual satisfaction from marriage. But like I said, the information's out there, and we can't just take a hard line on it and be angry about it or be hurtful in the words that we say to people. We have to have adab. We have to have etiquette in how we interact with people and talk about these things. Okay, we have a couple more. Okay, my daughter's 9, and I'm already getting invitations for her to work on modeling. That's a tough one. I had I don't know if it's alhamdulillah, but the same situation. I decided that it wasn't a route to go because it's an industry that kids could really get sucked into, and I think maybe it sends the wrong message about what she's valuable for. But again, there are options out there. If she's just modeling kids' clothes and it's appropriate, I don't know. I mean, it's something that I would be really careful about that, though. I mean, that's just a parenting decision, really. Some Muslims bring up the argument that we should stand up for gay rights. They compare it to standing up for a Christian, the government. Again, when it comes to rights, it all depends on what those rights are, right? I think nobody should be mistreated. I think we should stand up against hate crimes and those kind of things. But when it comes to marriage and other things like that, I don't know. I mean, are they going to stand up for us for polygamous marriages if we wanted to do that? That's another question, but I'm not sure. I don't know how to answer that, actually. That would just be a personal opinion. If you were a hermaphrodite, would it be haram to get surgery to permanently change your gender? Again, I think in these extreme cases where there really is some gender, like dual genders when somebody's born, or really struggling with that, then I would think, I mean, you'd want to get a fatwa on that, talk to a scholar about it, but, and again, talk to a scholar from this country, please, a scholar who knows the issue that we're dealing with in this country and who understands these issues, because you can't just, that's one of the first things about when it comes to getting a scholar's opinion. They need to understand the culture within which they're making a decision about. That's one of the requirements. So for somebody to make a decision, it's not that simple. So make sure you talk to somebody here who knows. And like I always say, get a couple opinions so that you know that you're doing the right thing. Okay, it's the last one, I think. Is it haram to buy clothes from a gay designer? Are you supporting them by buying their products? I don't think so. I mean, again, that's such a part of who they are. I was just in the store the other day, and talking to this guy at a furniture store. It's almost like, and I was thinking about this because I had this topic, right? And I think he was gay, but who knows? But the point is that it's like, this guy's a human being. He treated us well. He helped us out a ton, right? But what he does in his private life doesn't affect me, especially as I don't know. I would just be assuming. So designers, there are lots of different talented people in our society. If you do that, if you reject him and not buy from him, then you are falling prey to making that being who he is. And that's not everything who he is. It's a small part of how he might define himself. But don't fall into that, because the people as human beings, we're so much more than that. And on a day of judgment, we're going to have to answer for all aspects of our lives. And like I said, when it comes to homosexuality, that's one piece of a larger issue. We need to all, make sure that we're in tune to that and help each other along those lines. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, first off, thank you so much for answering all those questions. I know there were a lot. We had a lot of questions, so we're going to save those for the next session, which is going to be called Talking Taboo, which is at 12 o'clock. So you guys should come attend that session if you want your questions answered. And you can just ask anything, because we got some pretty controversial questions. So yeah, thank you so much for coming, and thank you again, Edmund Arroyo. All right, assalamu alaikum. Have a nice day.